path into 12-step recovery. And it started, interestingly, with my wife and going to an inpatient treatment center. And then they had a thing called Family Week. If there was ever a euphemism, that is definitely one of them. Kind of seems happy and festive, doesn't it? And it turns out that it's where, the people who are responsible for the treatment try to convince you that addiction and all these other things that sort of make it difficult to live adult life are actually family issues rather than just individual issues. So in other words, if you're part of the family, you look at your part in it. Not a lot of people want to do that. I remember one woman in particular at Family Week who was adamant her husband's gambling problem was none of her business. She had nothing to do with it, and she wasn't going to, acknowledge it. And she literally threw a fit. And so we were all throwing fits inside. We really weren't, articulating it. But that's kind of where it started for me. I came back here and I started seeing a therapist right over here at Experiential Healing Center who specialized in trauma and addiction. I was just out to dinner last night with the Idlewild person who I won't name, but who was responsible for making that connection for me. And so we were talking about how he came to know about that practice. But anyway, one of the requirements for being part of that practice was that you attend 2 12-step meetings per week. At the time, I didn't have any intention of attending 12-step meetings, except perhaps as a way of trying to understand Elise better and her struggles. But I started going, and one of two things happens when you start going to meetings. You either think, I have nothing in common with these people, they're really messed up, I'm so thankful that I'm not, and you stop, or you listen and you start to let your guards down, and eventually you realize you have more in common with them than you do, then separates you, and then you start coming back. Then you maybe go out to lunch with the group. Typically, meals will follow meetings, and to start to get to know people, you realize they really do have a lot in common with you, even if superficially that's not the case. And then eventually you speak up, and then before you know it, you've been going to the same meeting for 12 years, as is the case with me. And I talked about RCA, Recovering Couples Anonymous. Elise and I have been going off and on for 12 years. So that's kind of how it happens. It becomes, sort of sneaks up on you, becomes part of your life. And it turns out, Bill Wilson, who's the co-founder of AA, was very clear that AA was a way of life. It was not a meeting, it was not a set of steps, it was not an alternative social function. It was all those things, but it was also a way of life. And once you become committed to that way of life, you don't want to stop going. It's sort of like church in that sense, right? I mean, once church becomes part of who you are, you want to go to church most weeks, right? And this is kind of what happens with 12-step fellowships. So does anybody remember what this slide in my presentation represents? Recommended last time. This is Idlewild. I don't know if you recognize that. This is me on Saturday night. It's not me actually, but it was a slide, a stock photo representing my experiences on Saturday night. That's representing my experiences on Sunday morning coming to church. Why did I juxtapose these two scenes?
Experience in church, they like the experience on Saturday night.
Yeah, it was really strange because on Saturday nights at a small little, very uncomfortable Sunday school room at Shady Grove Presbyterian Church, where about 30 people were packed in, I would have this very profound spiritual experience of connection and hope. And I felt very authentic. I felt like who I was, and I felt like who we were, was really clearly presented. There's a kind of freedom in that. And then I'd come to church and just look at our church. It's so formal, it's so perfect. So the walls are so, the angles are so correct. And if you come inside, you see everybody looking good. And the service is choreographed. And I'm part of this, right? I'm describing something that I'm very much a part of. It doesn't feel messy at all. This is really messy. there's one word that describes 12-step recovery that sort of distinguishes it from church, it's messiness. In terms of dress, you want language, go to 12-step meeting, you're going to hear some bad language. It's one of the things we specialize in. People are really, really good at it. It's very funny in many cases. But that's something that's you're going to notice if you're a church person. In terms of leadership, anybody can lead. You walk in, you're the first person there, you might end up leading the meeting. It's very different in terms of hierarchy and so forth. So this messiness was for me associated with kind of hope and an ability to be myself. And then there's nothing messy about that picture of our church, right? And there's really nothing messy about us on Sunday morning. Unless I'm missing something, unless people are like a special room, talking about messy stuff, I've missed it, right? So this disconnect was really strange to me, and I realized I was probably not the only person who had ever felt it, and it was probably a thing that was out there that I could explore more and learn more about. So that's what I set out to do. Next slide, please, sir. Yeah, so 2015. So I got an email, I don't even remember where it came from somebody was forwarded about a retreat that was being held in the Hill Country of Texas in March of 2015 put on by some outfit called the National Association for Christian Recovery. I'd never heard of this, didn't know anything about it, but I was intrigued. And I had a good friend, still a good friend, who I'd gotten to know really well through recovery, and it was also trying to figure out this sort of connection between church and recovery. And I said, hey, I was in my spring break. I said, hey, you want to drive to Austin next weekend? It's like, okay. So we got to know each other really well. Obviously, it's a lot farther than it looked on the map. But we went, and it was just this amazing experience. And I remember it was a typical sort of churchy weekend retreat, right? So we had some programming, some free time. There were speakers, there were small groups. A lot of the connections came around meals. And I remember the very first, this must have been, we got there late Friday night, this must have been Saturday morning. So Saturday morning we got up, and the very first sort of meeting presentation, the guy got up, a pastor from Houston, and started talking about the connection between, he started talking about himself and his addiction and his recovery. And to hear a pastor get up in front of a group of people talking about their addiction did something to me. The waterworks started to cry. There was something about the realness of that, the connectedness, the authenticity that I was totally unprepared for. Guys turned out to be a really good friend of mine. We kind of bonded over that and some other things, but it was just so strange. And so every meal was like that, right? You're talking to people you hardly know, and they're talking about their deepest, darkest secrets. They're talking about the things they've done that they're not proud of, that they're ashamed of, the things that got them fired from their church job, whatever it is. And you have this connection with people that is so unusual, and so unpredictable, and so unexpected. And at that point, I was hooked. So I started going to NACR meetings. They had one in the summer of 2015 in Pasadena, California. They had another one in Colorado Springs the following year. I went to these week-long things. And in both cases, about 100 people from all over the country who were involved in recovery ministry in some way. Now, there's a difference between being involved in ministry to people who are addicts and being a recovering addict yourself, right? There's a big difference. Because what happened, you can be somebody who cares about addicts, who cares about people in recovery, but does not identify yourself, and therefore you remain sort of safely out of that world, right? These were all people who could talk about helping others, but also talk about doing their own work, right? Working the steps themselves, going to meetings themselves, and that was the currency of the realm. So these meetings were really important to me, and I decided by the end of the meeting 2016, I was going to write a book about this, because what else do you do? If you're really curious about something and you can't find anything that's really been written about it that you like or that really explains it the way you want to explain it, I decided to write a book. So I told my wife at this point I was never going to write another book. That was kind of the agreement we had. I'd written enough. The world didn't really need any more books from me. But there was something about this topic that I just felt called to really explore. And so I got encouragement from other people. So I had a sabbatical in 2017. I decided I'm just going to visit. I'm going to travel around. I'm going to visit as many different places as I can find that try to do this thing called recovery in a church setting or from a church perspective. First thing I had to do, go to the next slide, Daniel. First thing I had to do was educate myself about this whole world, right? I didn't know really anything about it. And so I just sort of went online and tried to, tried to get a sense for what was out there. What was the landscape like? So the biggest thing on the landscape is something called Celebrate Recovery. Anybody heard of Celebrate Recovery? Yeah, so if you haven't, you should. There are 30,000 Celebrate Recovery groups around the world. It is the fastest growing, most successful church programming movement of the last 50 years. If you were to go home and look online, you'd find 15 or 20 Celebrate Recovery meetings within driving distance of this place, right? This is a movement that started about 1990. It was focused in Saddleback Community Church in California, which is the church where Rick Warren is the pastor. And it was an attempt, well, the way I would describe it is there was a guy at Saddleback who was, had got sober in AA, was also a Christian, and he kind of felt the same thing that I described, right? He felt this disconnect between church and AA. For him, being in Southern California, he didn't feel like he was really free to talk about his relationship with God in AA meetings. He felt like, he was sort of ridiculed if he mentioned Jesus. And so he decided he needed to find some way to bridge his recovery and his faith. And his solution was to start a recovery group in his church. And so that's what Celebrate Recovery is. I say in the book, oh, by the way, I brought a copy of the book this week. Helpful? Pass it around. I say in the book that, if the goal of a lot of people, including me, is to make church more like AA. Is to make church more like AA. What Celebrate Recovery does is make AA more like church. It sort of takes the things from AA that work and that are attractive to Christians and sort of churchifies them, brings them inside the church. So you don't have bad language. You can't use bad language in Celebrate Recovery. It's led by people who are trained. You see already that it's gone off the tracks, right? In my view. So people who are trained, there's a certain script that's used for every meeting, right? That all that is sort of violates the sort of DNA of AA. And the other thing, I went to a summit in 2018 at Saddleback Church in California. We had like 3,000 people coming together to talk about this. And it's very clear what the leadership hierarchy was, right? You have the head of the whole thing, you have regional leaders, state leaders. That's anathema to AA. Remember I said last time, what the founders of AA realized is they were incorrigibly grandiose, right? They were very, very impressed with themselves and their accomplishments. Ego, the big problem with them was ego run rampant. This is how they describe it. And as a solution to that problem, they had to introduce some practices that are very important. You don't use last names, right? You use last initials. You don't talk about what you do for a living. You don't sort of advertise how much money you have or how successful you are, because those are the things that make you a drunk. Those are the things that ultimately will lead you to be unsober. So there's this sort of great leveling effect, right? Everybody's really, it doesn't matter how long you've been sober, it doesn't matter what you do, how much money you have, you're all there sort of in servant mode, you're all there in humility, realizing that if left to your own devices, you're going to use, which is the one thing you can't do. Okay, so that's 2017. So that's what I knew. And my parents were very helpful. They knew a guy in their church who ran Celebrate Recovery. They gave me a bunch of books and read them and stuff. So I visited some Celebrate Recovery groups. Go to the next one. I also decided to be as eclectic as possible. So I wanted to visit Christian recovery ministries around the country that took different approaches. So one place I went, a good friend is an Episcopal priest in Austin, and I was talking to him, and he said, the Episcopal Diocese of Texas has a recovery committee or commission, and they do a lot of stuff. And I knew this was a big thing in the Episcopal Church. Grace St. Luke's has a recovery commission. They do a recovery Sunday every year. They have a lot of other stuff going on. So I went to a retreat in April 2017 at the Episcopal Diocese of Texas, and this is what's interesting about the research I did. So I went in every case as a person in recovery, not purely as a scholar. Right? So this is called ethnographic work. This is where you enter into a community and you're a participant observer, right? So you're partly an observer, you're partly doing research, but you're also participating. Because I was in recovery, I could participate. I could tell my story, I could lead the meetings and stuff like that. So I participated in this Episcopal recovery retreat. It's really interesting. I talk about it in the book. Then I went to Austin to meet with the guy named, gosh, what's his last name? Bob. We'll call him Bob for now. It'll come to me. And his name's, yeah. So, but he runs an organization called Friends of Dr. Bob. And his story is, Dr. Bob is the other co-founder of AA, along with Bill W. So Friends of Dr. Bob is an attempt to reintroduce the spiritual practices that were popular among the early AA pioneers, right? We haven't talked about the Oxford group much. I'll just mention it here. AA came out of was formed spiritually by a evangelical renewal movement called the Oxford group that was very popular in the US in the 20s and 30s. And both Dr. Bob and Bill W. were involved in the Oxford group in their hometowns of New York and Akron. And they took a lot of the sort of ideas for the steps and the sort of emphasis on change and transformation. They took it right from the Oxford group. What this guy, whose name still escapes me, but will come to me, probably on my way out the door, what he did, he's an Episcopal priest, and he decided that there was something really powerful about early AA that had been lost. According to the annals of AA, the recovery rate in the early days was about 75%. That's pretty remarkable. The recovery rate for AA today is much lower than that. It's really hard to pin down. But the problem is people don't stay with it. People who stay with it get sober, but it's difficult to get people to stay with it. So we thought there must have been some, and they didn't really have many meetings in the early days. There must have been something they were doing that was really transformative that we've lost. And he discovered it in something called two-way prayer. And this was a sort of a practice that the Oxford group had perfected of keeping prayer journals, speaking to God, listening to God, sharing with other people, testing guidance anyway. You can check it out, he's on the website. But this was another sort of way of taking 12-step recovery and seeing how it could influence the church. This guy actually has a monastic community now that he's set up based on the 12 steps and based on two-way prayer. The people who, not a monastic community is not the same, not the right word. Because people aren't living together in a monastic place, but they take on a common rule. So their life is governed by certain practices wherever they live, right? This is what he does. Then I went to a retreat in St. Louis in the summer of 2017. It was put on by a group called 12-Step Outreach. So 12-Step Outreach is a Catholic group that tries to apply centering prayer to 12-step recovery. Does anybody know what centering prayer is? Contemplative prayer. You may have done it. Mary McIntosh is very much in a centering prayer, has had a centering prayer group that has met from time to time. So step 11 is, what is step 11, Steve? I probably should have looked it up before I started that sentence, but
it's quoted here.
Yeah.
Prayer meditation to improve our conscious
contact with God. Yeah, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God. That's step 11. So there are actually step 11 groups that focus on this step. And so what you might find in a step 11 group is after the introduction, they're like 20 or 30 minutes of meditation or silence. And then that's sort of the essence of the meeting. What 12-step outreach does is tries to use centering prayer as an 11th step practice, which will support and enhance recovery. And it was really interesting to go to this retreat. I was in a Catholic retreat center. A lot of people, most of them were from St. Louis, people who deeply believed in meditation. A lot of them define themselves as lapsed Catholics or former Catholics, but they had really sort of latched on to this spiritual practice as something that was important to them, important to their recovery. And it sort of indicated to me this, I'm not going to take that call, indicated to me something interesting about the relationship between the church and recovery. There are a lot of people whose relationship to the church is complicated. They don't feel safe there once they, because they have struggled with an addiction, they don't feel like they can talk about it. Or maybe they like church, but kind of like me, they found a spiritual home that was very welcoming. They didn't want to give up. And what was the relationship between the two? A lot of these people I met in St. Louis. Go one more slide. So then when I was traveling, for whatever reason, I would stop at churches that I could find, local churches that had some sort of recovery theme. So I was in New York City for, I think it was a family trip over fall break in 2018, and I found this place called Recovery House of Worship in Brooklyn. Well, that's obviously someplace I gotta see. So I went to Recovery House of Worship. It's very interesting. In this case, recovery was a theme in the church, but it wasn't like a recovery church, like everybody was in recovery, but it just sort of, it was a sort of a way that people could identify with what the church was about, an emphasis on, it was an urban neighborhood where a lot of people had drug addictions. The guy who was the pastor was a sober addict and so forth. So that was really interesting. And then different model. This was in Powell. Is Powell a town in East Tennessee? I don't know. This is near Knoxville. Yeah. So I went to Powell United Methodist Church, and I went on a Thursday night, and this is what you find. They have a big worship service that's sort of modeled on Celebrate Recovery. So it's like worship singing and a message that's 12-step theme. And then they have these various meetings you can go to: grief, loss support, sexual integrity for men, family support, men conquering substance abuse, women conquering substance abuse. And then WAGs, we all got something, which is, I guess, the catch-all for people who don't identify with the former categories, right? So this is another model.
We all got something.
We all got something. This was a model that was pretty common. I found in a lot of places. Go one more slide. So a couple of other ones. So there's a church in North Mississippi called the Orchard. Tupelo, there's a branch in Tupelo. I don't think that's the main branch, but they have a Thursday night service called Thrive, and it's like a separate church. So interesting. So think of like Wednesday night here, as we used to have, but think of it as being very different than Sunday morning. So the way people dress, the people who come, the kind of language they use is very different. So it's much more like a 12-step meeting than it is a church service. And they have a recovery pastor. And so the guy whose face you would see, whose voice you would hear on Thursday night, is not the tall steeple pastor you would hear on Sunday morning. It's this young guy who talks about being in rehab and stuff like that. It's it's another model for doing recovery ministry where you have somebody identified with it. And then, as it turned out, a lot of this was serendipitous. So I was going to see my parents who live in Vero Beach, Florida now, and I was going to be down there for a few days, and I thought, surely there's someplace I can visit down there. So I go on the internet, and I discovered this thing called the Recovery Church Movement. It was started maybe 10 years ago, and its focus is really down here on the east coast of Florida. There are some other places where it's spread, but it's mainly Pompano Beach, Lantana, Vero Beach, Palm Beach County, and Indian River County. And so I got in touch with the guy who had started it and met with him, and it was really interesting. I visited a couple of their churches, and it's a different model because it's sort of like, so in Lantana, for instance, I guess that's southern Palm Beach County. They found a church that was going under, a Lutheran church that was failing, whose congregation had moved. They bought the church basically, and they used the building to do church in a different way. So they have a weeknight service, and it's full of 12-step themes, and it's people who are Palm Beach and Broward County is kind of the rehab center of America. I don't know if you know that, but there are lots of places down there where people come in and out of treatment. So you get a lot of people who are involved in treatment, have been in rehab, and doing church kind of for those folks. So another model, a church created by the recovery community for the recovery community. So this is interesting. It's not really coming from the direction of the church. It's coming from the direction of the recovery community. So different models. Go forward. I don't even know what's next. Okay. So at this point, I had seen enough to know that there was a phenomenon out there that needed to be described, that needed to be analyzed. Nobody had really done it. I don't think I ever really got the whole picture, but I think I have a pretty good idea of what's out there. And so then I started looking at literature. I started just studying what people had written over time about the relationship of the church and AA. And the earliest article I could find was from 1949. It was about 10 years after the publication of the big book, the Alcoholics Anonymous Bible. And it's called Alcoholics Anonymous Speaks to the Church. It was written by a pastoral counselor who was involved in helping people with alcoholism. And he was really convinced that the church had something to learn from Alcoholics Anonymous. This is the first example I can find of this. Then there were some others. There's one in the 50s by Sam Shoemaker, who was an Episcopal priest involved in the founding of AA, what the church has to learn from Alcoholics Anonymous. Then I'll skip a while and I'll go to the 21st century. I just was amazed at how many articles there are online, and most of these are online articles, that have basically the same title, the same theme. AA looks more like church than a lot of churches, 2007. The church gathering should be like a good AA meeting, 2013. What the church can learn from AA, 2013. What the church can learn from AA, 2014. These are all written by different people. Why can't church be more like AA? I just stole that one from my book title. 2015, what the church can learn from Anonymous, 2016, 15 things, AA Church, 2017. I could keep going, I'm sure there are a lot more now. But this, I talk about this phenomenon with the phrase AA envy. There's something about AA, and I think in this case, AA stands for all 12-step recovery meetings, not just AA. Something about 12-step recovery that when Christians see it, experience it, kind of get a sense of what it's about, they're envious. So the question is, what are they envious of? So to answer that question, I kind of looked at the history, right? I mentioned that AA really comes out of the Oxford group. It really is, in many ways, a Christian movement that's been secularized. A lot of people today complain about the trappings of Christianity that are still involved in it, and they have their own ways to deal with that. But why is it that people in the 21st century who are looking at AA from across the street or wherever, or across the hall, right? Maybe on a weeknight, people meet in this place, an AA meeting, maybe you wander in there one time and you realize, wow, this is really different. I'll just tell you about my experience. There's an NA meeting that meets here on Tuesday nights, or used to. I was embarrassed. I asked a friend of mine who was in NA, what meeting do you go to? The one at your church. Oh, the biggest one in the city. Oh. The one that has about 100 people coming to it every Tuesday night. Oh. The one that had to move from the classroom into the whatever that is. No. Completely forgotten. We're used to TK Young Room because there were so many people. Oh, that one. Okay.
I think they used to meet in dirt.
Yeah. Well, they outgrew it at some point, and maybe they're back. I don't know. But anyway, I visited, and it was so weird because here I was in a place that was just smack in the middle of the space where I'm usually going to church or having a meal or something. And the welcome I got, I called ahead and said, I'm just going to visit. I don't want anybody to freak out. I do kind of, I'm associated with the church, but I'm not there to, spy on you or anything. So hugs all around. First time I met hugs, right? When was the last time you walked in a place and somebody who never met you gave you a hug? It's not that common, right? And there was this sense of a lot of profanity, first of all. I mean, much more profanity than I hear on Sunday mornings in the TK Young Room after church. Lots of, just from old people, right? My age and older to, kids. Just a very different kind of ethos, and that's what I want to talk about in the next slide. So what is it about recovery meetings generally that when people experience them, they say, that's what I want in church? So this was one of the challenges of the book, to try to sort of isolate that and distill it, because nobody says definitively what it is I've gleaned. So this is a list that's short and, is we can work with. The first thing on the list for me would be authenticity. People present themselves in their brokenness. If you think about this, you go to a 12-step meeting, you walk in the door, you're admitting you're not on a winning streak, right? This is how people put it, right? Something's wrong, right? You wouldn't be there. You didn't wander in just thinking, I think I'll check this out and see what people are struggling with, right? If you wander in and you were checking it out, you've got a problem that you're close to realizing step one. Came to believe, no, realized we were powerless over alcohol and our lives have become unmanageable. So you are either at that point or you're getting there, that your powerlessness and your life's unmanageable. That's not how people present in church, right? When you walk into church, you're saying pretty much the opposite. I'm good. I'm fine. How are you? I'm fine. You fine? We're fine, right? This is what we do. That's about the level that we interact with people. And that's not just church, there's other places as well. So it's a very different sort of ticket in, right? One of the things I'll say about Celebrate Recovery that I really appreciate is the way people introduce themselves in Celebrate Recovery meetings. In an AA meeting, you say, I'm Steve and I'm an alcoholic. The way you introduce yourself in a Celebrate Recovery meeting is, I'm Steve, I'm a believer who struggles with alcoholism, right? It's not quite the same, but it is introducing yourself in terms of your sort of least desirable attribute, right? Your biggest struggle. And that's a big paradigm shift for Christians, right? Imagine every time you introduced yourself in a Christian setting, you said, you identified your biggest struggle, whatever that is. So that's something. So authenticity is a big part of it. People just feel like they can be themselves. And I think you have to really experience that to appreciate what it's like. As somebody who is a college professor, is identified with a prominent church in a leadership role, I'm really careful about what I say about myself and, my struggles in public. I go into a 12-step meeting and the expectation is that I'm going to be honest, that if I'm not, people are just going to not really listen to me, not pay attention. So I have to kind of acknowledge what's going on. And I can only, I don't know if I can put in words how freeing it is to be honest about stuff with people who you have their support and they're going to understand, and there's going to be confidentiality. And it's just a sort of a sense of congruity in yourself and between yourself and your persona that's really, really amazing. And I've really come to appreciate that. Second one is seriousness of purpose. People are desperate in search of transformation, right? So when Lisa and I went to RCA the first time, we had with people in recovery called the gift of desperation. Again, you're not there because things are going well. You're desperate, you're afraid, you're without hope. And that's a gift because you're going to do whatever people tell you to do, right? You're gonna, if people say, look, we've been where you are, this is what you have to do to get out of it, to save your marriage, that's what you're gonna do. If you get a sponsor couple, as we did, and they say, meet us at Starbucks on Friday night, and you're ready to talk about your first step, that's what you're gonna do. And you trust them because they've been the same place you are, and they've gone through it, they've survived. You're like, yeah, we'll do that. We'll do whatever it takes. And so that seriousness of purpose goes a long way. When you realize that everybody is really in the same boat and is searching for the same thing. Acceptance, there's a sense of belonging and connection. This is when people write about 12-step groups, this is something they say a lot. I walked in and I just felt accepted. Somebody hugged me, right? They brought me in. There's a new, if you're a newcomer, they have a newcomer meeting. Newcomer meeting is the only time people will talk directly to you. People will tell their stories, they'll say welcome, they'll offer their phone number, contact info, they'll invite you to lunch. You know, let's face it, a lot of people visit churches like this and they feel invisible, or they don't, or they're not noticed, or they don't feel comfortable, they're not dressed right, whatever it is, and they don't come back. That's not IOL, that's just a feature of church visitation. It's very well documented. You cannot walk into a 12-step meeting and not get noticed, unless maybe it's one of those 100 people meetings, and then it's, if people don't recognize you, they're gonna want to know your story. You know, I teach a class at Rhodes called Addiction Recovery and Spirituality. One of the things students have to do is attend 6 12-step meetings, which is a great experience. But often, even if it's an open meeting, which means anybody can go, they get recognized. They'll sort of make the mistake of identifying as a newcomer, which I tell them don't do, but they kind of panic. And then everybody wants to know their story. You know, and they don't know what they should say, right? But people genuinely want to know their story. They genuinely want them to come back, because they think if you wandered in here the first time, there's a good reason you're here, and we want you to come back. Non-judgmentalism. This is a big one, right? Especially for people who've grown up in the church, feel a sense of shame, feel a sense of not being good enough. They feel that God is, you know, the great sort of enemy of fun and you know, human enjoyment. And they are very sensitive to judgmentalism of any kind. And so that's one reason maybe they stopped going to church, or they wouldn't seek recovery to church. So that's something that people comment on. I didn't feel any shame. I felt like people, I told my secret, people went, oh, okay. Because they kind of were familiar with that. Or, yeah, you know, we've heard worse, you know, things like that. It's not the reaction people expect in church. Informality, I've mentioned this already, the dress code, wear whatever you want. Salty language, no hierarchy, leaders as servants, right? This idea that to be a leader is to be a servant, is to do 12-step service, 12-step service. So 12-step service, what's step 12? Daniel, you've got access to them.
No, I was just reading from it. It's the one where you go out and help other people.
Yeah, right. I just can't remember the wording of it. So anyway, tried to carry the message to other alcoholics, I think, something like that, right? So step 12 is basically, you know, becomes a motto for life in recovery, right? It's about service. It's about sponsoring other people the way somebody sponsored you. It's about leading meetings. It's about gathering people for a meal. It's about, you know, seeking people who have sort of fallen by the wayside, see if they need help. So this is this idea of servanthood is really important. And again, it's an antidote for grandiosity. The early alcoholics realized their biggest problem was they were so full of themselves and so proud of their accomplishments that they needed to excise that egocentrism. They needed to go from being self-centered to God-centered. And if they didn't, they were going to die of alcoholism. They just sort of figured that out. And that's what sort of made them unique. And the last thing is messiness. So the concept of sober addict is really strange to think about, right? We think of people as being addicted, being addicts, or being sober, right? You're either an alcoholic or you're sober. You're either an alcoholic, you're not an alcoholic. That's not the way AA sees it. You're either an alcoholic, you're an alcoholic or you're not. But if you happen to be an alcoholic, you're either sober or you're not. But you're never not an alcoholic. And this is the sort of insight of AA that's so powerful. You are not like other people. You cannot drink like other people. Sorry about that, but that's just the reality. Your life has proven that pretty definitively, right? That's the reason you're here. You cannot drink like other people. You can't manage it. You can't moderate it. You're always going to be an alcoholic. The question is, are you going to be a sober one or not? And so this idea of being a sober addict is really revolutionary. And it creates a great deal of humility, right? Because you don't recover from something like alcoholism. You're not a recovered alcoholic. You're a recovering alcoholic. You're a recovering sex addict, food addict, whatever it is. And so you're constantly aware that anytime you're on the precipice of going back there. And it makes you very humble. It makes you very sort of circumspect, but it means that you expect life to be messy. Relapse is part of recovery. Relapse is messy, right? It's disappointing. It's shameful. But if you're a sober addict, you're gonna, even if you don't use, you're probably gonna act like an addict. One of the things you do in step 4 is you make a catalog of your character defects. Boy, isn't that fun. You kind of know them anyway, but there you are making a list with your sponsor, and then you're sort of in step 5, acknowledging them and asking God to take them away, but they don't really go away. What you have is a catalog of character defects that you're going to have the rest of your life. The question is, are you going to kind of manage them, or are you going to indulge them and end up using them? And so that's again, messy, because if one of your character defects is dishonesty, what recovery is going to do is make you hypersensitive to dishonesty. And anytime you find yourself being dishonest in the slightest way, you're going to be aware of it. And you're going to think, I need to do something about that. One of the mottos of AA and 12-step recovery generally is progress, not perfection, which is a really good one, because again, it's not something you don't work the steps once and you're done. You don't acknowledge you're an alcoholic or an addict once and you're done. You don't figure out how to live life successfully, you're done. It's constantly progress, not perfection. And by the way, 12-step recovery has lots of mottos, lots of little sayings that if you are familiar with it, you'll hear them say them all the time, right? One day at a time, whatever it takes. What are some others? Keep it simple. Yeah, and this is one of them, progress, not perfection. Another one is attraction, not promotion. So you don't promote AA, you don't go to your friend and say, I think if you use AA, you ought to come, see us. You live a life that's attractive, and if people who see that life want to experience part of it, then they'll show up. Okay, let's see what's next. I don't even know. Let's see where we go. Okay, so let me say a little bit about, last time I mentioned that church gatherings and recovery gatherings, as much as we want them to be similar, they reflect different cultures, right? And I borrowed this next series of slides from a guy named Dale Ryan, who's studied this a lot. He describes therapeutic culture, recovery culture, and Christian culture as these intersecting but largely separate circles. Therapeutic culture is like, you go to a therapist kind of thing. Recovery culture and Christian culture, they have these areas of overlap, but they're really different. Go forward. So therapeutic culture, right, says all you need is a good therapist. That's really what you need. You can go to church and recovery meetings if you want to, but what you really need is a good therapist. Recovery culture, if people are really into it, what you need is the 12 steps. Sure, go to church if you need to, but what you really need to do is work the steps. And Christian culture says all you need is church, or all you need is God's word, or whatever. And so there's not a lot of overlap sometimes. Go forward. And one of the places where these differences play out is the way we do small groups, right? So, we can think of church as the big Sunday morning group, or we can think of it as Christ care groups, or Bible study groups, or Presbyterian women groups, right? We have all these small group things, but they tend to have different characters. Most small groups in the church are open to all people, right? Unless it's specific to women or to people of a certain age. Recovery groups are not open to all people. Even though AA, many groups are open, the rule is the only requirement for membership is the desire not to drink. That desire can be for the rest of your life, it can be for the rest of that day, you qualify, but it's pretty specific, right? Leadership. In small groups, in church small groups, training is valued, creativity and leadership is encouraged, right? You don't just want any old person standing up to teach Sunday school, you want somebody who has something to say and maybe been trained and done before. Traditional leadership styles are suspect in recovery culture. Rotating leadership and meeting scripts are common. The reason anybody can lead a meeting is because when you walk in, there's a notebook and you open it and it's got a script and it tells you exactly what to say and what to do. I mean, you really have to be, well, say it differently. It's really easy to lead a meeting, right? All you got to do is really is come up with a topic, and if you can't come up with a topic on the fly, you can say, does anybody have a burning desire to speak about something? And then if nobody does, you can say, well, this is an open topic meeting, discuss whatever you want, right? It's not a lot that's required. The goals, social networking, maybe learning some things, getting to know people in the church. Goals, personal transformation. That's different, right? This is why people go to 12-step meetings. You don't go to see your friends. You don't go to be recognized. You go because you need it. Okay, next. So group process is different. Discussion centered with cognitive emphasis, right? We're learning stuff, hopefully. Testimony centered with effective emphasis. What people do in 12-step meetings is typically they tell stories. And if it's a newcomer meeting, they tell the story about what I was like, what happened, what I'm like now. So it's this sort of definite, this story with a definite arc of, things were bad. This is how I hit bottom. This is how I got out of it. This is where I am now. Or you tell stories around the theme. So let's say the theme is step 4, character defects. How do our character defects, continue to, continue to affect us? And so everybody's got a story about that, right? And a lot of them are funny. And that's the other feature of 12-step meetings that you don't find a lot in church is laughter. And when I say laughter, I mean really hard belly laughs, right? Because what happens is people don't tell jokes. They tell stories about themselves that are so funny because they're so typical of the way addicts think, right? This is what everybody recognizes, right? So I decided what I would do is I would, there are lots of stories like this in the AA Big Book. I'll tell one story. So there's a classic story. The guy is a terrible alcoholic and decides to stop at this, bar and because he's got some time off in his sales job. And so I decided what I would do is, I would drink some milk. That would be a good thing to do, and no problem there. And then I thought, I've never tried whiskey and milk. I wonder what that tastes like, right? And everybody's laughing hilariously, right? Because you can see exactly where this is going, right? The guy ends up in the sanitarium. But it was such a good thought. It was such an innocent thought, right? So what's called alcoholic thinking or addictive thinking is often part of the stories people tell. And people laugh, but they relate. Confidentiality is rare. I wouldn't expect that, any classes you've been in at church, there's an expectation of confidentiality. Maybe you just have the sense not to talk about things that you've heard, but it's not expected. Confidentiality is essential, right? Last time we did this, what you've heard, what you've seen here, who you've seen here, what you've heard here, let it stay here. And the response is here, right? It's just a reminder in every meeting. Gradual transition from low to high disclosure. Confession is entry-level commitment. Typically, if somebody's a newcomer, they're asked to speak and they may just give the whole spiel right there, right? They don't know anybody, but they've just thrown it all up because they have to. Next one. Offering advice, drawing people out, clarifying ideas or values. Ideas of value, crosstalk prohibited. Last week, somebody online said, well, what's so bad about crosstalk? Advice can be so helpful when you're sharing. This is really, really a no-no in 12-step meetings. And as I said last time, people will call you out if you crosstalk. If you comment on somebody else, directly on somebody else's share, or if you presume to give advice or otherwise instruct them, you're going to be called out on it. Why is that? I've been thinking about this all week. I think it's because this is people, especially addicts, default mode to give advice to other people, to help other people, to straighten them out, right? Because they're really smart and they're really, able to, run their lives. So why don't they run yours, right? It's kind of a joke, but people don't want advice. They want an acknowledgement, kind of a knowing nod. The language that's used to describe what you get from a meeting is experience, strength, and hope. So if somebody shares about an issue that you can relate to, you might say, I've got some experience, strength, and hope on that topic. And let me tell you what's happened to me, right? You see how that's different than crosstalk? Like, I've done this. This is what I've learned. This is what I can offer in the way of hope. So that's different than, have you tried so-and-so? Have you called this person? Group experience is the focus versus most of the hard work is done outside the group. This is really true. If you're going to go to AA meetings, I mean, you can go and something may happen to you just by being in the same presence of sober people, but maybe not. But if you're really going to be sober, if you're going to be in the life of recovery, you got to work the steps, you got to do other things, you got to be willing to call people. This is one of the features of 12-step recovery that is, I think, underreported. When you are in a situation where you're feeling squirrely, and you might act out, you got to call somebody immediately. It doesn't really matter who it is, somebody in the fellowship, right? And just talking to them helps you, but it also helps them. It helps them because it helps them, it reminds them kind of where they could be and maybe how they've dealt with this stuff in the past. And there's one more slide. So spirituality, usually the same as the congregation in small groups, right? And that's pretty eclectic in this congregation, but there are limits. In a recovery group, there really are no limits, right? People are likely to say anything. In this part of the country, probably the majority of people have a kind of Christian background, and so they'll use language about God and about higher power that's Christian-y, but not always. And you have to be careful not to presume that the language you use is going to be acceptable to everybody else and maybe not trigger other people. So I've found people pretty sensitive about that. You know, they'll say my higher power, which I call God, right? They'll sort of personalize it. Let's see what's next. Yeah, so those are some barriers, right, to this question, why can't church be more like AA? Different cultures. Here's some others that I talk about in the book. The link between church membership and respectability. Okay, so one of the things about our culture that we just have to acknowledge is that going to church is something respectable people do. Right? You guys don't agree? You don't agree
Not so
there's
much anymore. I think that was true when I was a young person. Everybody went to church, and if you were respectable, you went to church. But I'm not so sure that that's true in today's world.
well, maybe not everybody who's respectable goes to church, but when you say that everybody who goes to church is respectable,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's probably still the assumption, right? Certainly in churches like ours, right? So anything that would question that respectability is not really welcome. It's not something that you're going to lead with. So I think that's one problem, right? Because if your main way of identifying yourself in a church environment is of what you struggle with or what you failed at or what you this illness you have, that really conflicts with this idea, this assumption of respectability, intellectual sophistication. We talked about some of these mottos, right? There are lots of them, and they're really simple. And there's an assumption in 12-step recovery that really it is simple. It's about surrender. And once you surrender, and that means surrendering your mind too, you know, you can get sober and you can stay sober. But the more you think about it, the more you analyze it, the less likely it's going to be that you're going to stay sober. This is very clear in the big book, right? A lot of smart people in early AA didn't get sober. And they realized pretty quickly, there's a one line in the big book that says, self-knowledge is not the answer. Learning about yourself is not the answer. You know, smart people don't always get sober, right? Religious people don't always get sober, right? There's a difference between being smart and being sort of wise and aware that you were powerless. Belief that admitting personal struggles is incompatible with piety. I don't know that so much is this church, but when I grew up, it certainly was. If you wanted to be seen as pious, you didn't have any personal struggles. You had conquered sin and in every form, right? And you didn't let any evidence to the contrary get out. So this is a problem. Belief that I've got the God stuff figured out. So you remember steps 2 and 3, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity and turned our life and our will over to God as we understood God. A lot of Christians, they start recovery and they go, oh, I got 2 and 3 knocked out. Let's go to 4. That's a real problem. I'll tell you the story a friend of mine tells. He's a pastor, the same pastor in Houston. So he was having a hard time getting sober from alcohol. He had chosen a sponsor who was very different from him, which is pretty typical biker guy. And he said he couldn't stay sober. And he said to his sponsor said to him, dude, your problem is you've never done a successful second step. Says this to a Christian pastor. He says, man, I've got a freaking PhD in the second step. And he said, I know that's your problem. Right? So for a lot of Christians, there's an assumption you've been going to church so long, you've been doing this so long, of course you got the God stuff. The problem is with step 3 in particular, turn our life and our will over to God as we understood God, right? It's not about belief. It's not about assent. It's not about showing up at church. It's not about reading creeds. It's about a willingness to trust God with everything, to turn everything over to God, your will and your life. That's a really tall order, even for people who've spent a lot of their lives in church. And so to get people to that, to understand what the third step requires is tough. And then what I call step 0. So this is my contribution to 12 step recovery, right? I added a step. Step 0 is I'm not fine. And most people in church are not able to get to that step. So you can never get to I'm powerless until you can get to I'm not fine, right? Because we're all fine all the time. That's how we interact with each other. That's how we connect with each other, with some exceptions. Sometimes if somebody's been in the hospital, it's clear they're not fine. If someone has lost a loved one, it's pretty obvious they're not fine. But the rest of the time, or they're divorced maybe, but the rest of the time, we're all fine. And so we can't expect to ever get, if we've really got a problem, we can't expect to ever to get even to step 1, this acknowledging the powerlessness. If we can't say, I'm really not fine. I know what it is, but I can't seem to stop drinking destructively. I can't seem to stop obsessing about, my husband who drinks destructively. I can't stop whatever it is, right? And I don't know how we get there except just keep rehearsing. I'm not fine, right? Until we get the courage to tell each other, I'm not really fine. And here's why. You never guess this by looking at me. I know it looks like I'm fine. No. And here's why, right? That's I think a step that in the right direction. So I've got more slides, but that's probably a good place to stop. So, well, I'll just say something about this slide since Daniel pulled it up. One of the things I do in the book, chapter 3, I think, is I analyze 6 memoirs by Christians who find recovery. These are all professional Christians. These 2 guys are pastors. This is a nun. This is a professional speaker. This is a seminary professor. This is a professional writer. They all are cruising along, really well in Christian circles, whatever their Christian circle is, whether it's in a convent or in a seminary. And they have this secret addiction or problem that they've never really dealt with because they didn't know how to deal with it in the church. They didn't feel like they could. And then guess what? They bottomed out, right? They hit bottom. Something terrible happened. This guy is arrested picking up a prostitute on the way to Christmas Eve service. Get your attention. This guy is discovered in a park exchanging pornography with other people. This is before the internet, in a kind of a public thing. This woman is it's just a nasty person. She's a nun, but she's a nasty alcoholic, and her, co-nuns, whatever, her sisters just say, you need help. This guy is a really famous, Keith Miller, famous evangelical author from the 70s, who just has a kind of personal breakdown, and the only thing he can find that gives him help is 12-step meetings. This guy is a seminary professor in Minnesota, very famous guy, Jim Nelson, who at one point finds himself in a hotel room about a mile from his house, just drinking himself into oblivion, and finally goes to rehab. And she is kind of the same thing. She's a closet alcoholic. I don't know if closet's the right word. She's carrying like an oversized purse, so she has alcohol everywhere she goes, You think people would notice in her family. That's kind of her thing. You'd think people would notice, but they don't. So these people all have the same experience, which is why is it that my faith didn't help me overcome this? Why is it that my faith did nothing to keep me from being an addict? 2, why is it that I had to go to a 12-step meeting to discover the kind of healing that I needed, to discover the kind of church community that I really want? And what do we do about all that? So that's another feature of the book. Any questions before? Yeah.
Well, one's a comment and one's a question. And the first comment is, I had a cousin who's now deceased who became a Methodist minister because he was a recovering alcoholic. He wanted to have a faith-based alcohol ministry. And so he just put up with the rest of us, you know, which I always thought was really funny, put up with the rest of us. So
Yeah.
he ministered to other alcoholics.
Yeah, cool.
And the second thing is, for years, I've sent people to AA who have alcohol problems, because I'm an internist and I see lots of people with alcohol
Yeah.
problems. But a lot of them are not really Christians, and they come back and they say they felt really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So do you have any thoughts about what to do for those people?
It happens, and there are sort of affinity groups within AA, like AA Agnostica, which are sort of agnostic for agnostics and atheists. I don't think there are any meetings here, but there are online meetings that you can go to where people share that kind of point of view. There are a lot of people who have that experience. Yeah, and it can also differ by the meeting itself.
Right.
So anyway, yeah. One of you.
I did. I know exactly why there's a difference between church and AA. Because I learned from my mother, you wear your very best clothes at church. Absolutely. Ministries, you're on your best behavior. The last place I would go for counseling would be my pastor.
Yeah.
That was in Baptist church.
Well, you know, yeah, and we kind of felt the same way in 2008 when we sort of hit a crisis. I mean, we certainly knew there were people that we could confide in, but the idea that there was anybody out there who had experienced something that we'd experienced, we didn't think anybody here had. We had to find some other place where people had problems, the kind of problems we had, right? We just didn't think we would find any, I won't say support, but any kind of, common experience. Other comments or questions? I've been talking a lot.
I don't really know how to say what I'm thinking. I've been thinking about it this week. And when you said the authentic self,
Yeah.
that we're not authentic around in this room, for example, or something like that. I'm wondering if the authentic self is the self, or if there are a lot. I think I have a lot of selves.
Sure.
And so we all think of ourselves as broken if we're Christians and blah, 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 but that's not exactly what you're talking about.
Not exactly.
So I'm trying to see that this idea that we're not authentic, and I think a lot of times we are authentic in a part of us is in these more rarefied churchy kinds of situations. I don't know. There's something about that. I'm not sure.
So would you say that church is a place that's safe for a part of yourself to be on display, but not all of it? That's how I feel about me.
Well, I agree. I agree with that.
I definitely, part of me feels very comfortable in church.
But probably that's true almost everywhere except in the recovery groups, because they are focused on, we're going to get it all out there. And most people don't, maybe they don't need to be in that or don't want to. I don't know. Does everybody need to be in something where I come in on Sunday morning and show you what I was thinking about in the middle of the night when I was thinking?
I don't know, I do. I'd say that 12-step meetings that I know of are the only places where I feel completely authentic. There are other places where I feel authentic to the degree, in church, in school, whatever. I feel like I'm who I claim to be to a large extent, but I don't feel completely transparent. And I guess maybe that's the other word that comes to mind, right? There's a sense in which there's a freedom to kind of be who you really are and not uphold appearances. I find that really valuable. But you're right, not everybody does, maybe. We call them normies. Or muggles or civilians, right? Not everybody has an addiction. Not everybody has a dysfunction that requires recovery. We kind of suspect everybody does, honestly, when we say that, but we say it because, yeah, right? Not everybody, it didn't work for everybody. So.
The,
Can I, sorry.
oh, I'm sorry.
I was just thinking about last week's meeting and, the RCA
Mhm.
sounded like a great thing. I was not familiar with it. It's
Yeah.
awesome that this has a meeting.
Yeah,
This is probably a dumb question, but all the anonymous meetings are based on recovering from an addiction, correct?
yeah.
So what is the addiction for the RCA group? Is it the addiction to a dysfunctional dynamic? Or
Yeah.
what is it?
Well, I think what it's, the way RCA phrases it is we share a bunch of addictions and dysfunctions, right? So it's kind of all inclusive. Typically, the reason people end up there is because one member of the couple has realized they're addicted and they realize that it affects their coupleship. And so they bring the other person. Sometimes it's two people who are in recovery who meet and want to get together, get married, and they realize they need to do it together. A lot of times it's people who go to marriage counseling and the outlook is bleak and they're told you need to go to RCA if you want a chance. That was kind of our situation. So we went to RCA before either one of us was really identifying as an addict. So it's just sort of a whole collection of reasons. And people don't really talk. You don't identify. The way you identify to me, I'm Steve, I'm recovering with Elise. I'm Elise, I'm recovering with Steve. That's all you have to say. You can say more. People generally don't talk, specifically about stuff because there's not really any need to, but you can. And of course, when you go out to dinner, you learn all good shit anyway, right?
Right.
It just sort of happens as you get to know them, right? You kind of know the story. But the other thing I said last week that I think is really cool about RCA, people come in like this, right? Somebody's really messed up. Somebody's got a problem. The other person's like, I don't have a problem, but my problem is I'm married to this person with a problem. And will somebody please recognize that they need to get their stuff together? And then, slowly over time, we kind of realize, look, if we're going to make this work, we kind of got to acknowledge that we've all contributed to the mess we're in, right? And that's a hard thing for people who feel like they're here. I didn't do anything, This guy is the one who messed up, talk to him. That's not sustainable. Say what you want about whether it's fair, it's not sustainable in marriage, right? So you have to sort of work through that.
We're out of time.
We're out of time, I know.
Next week.